On February 28th, I took a flight from Barcelona, where I've been living for the past 3+ years, back to Atlanta. The plane touched down and I turned on my phone and got the news. Steve Lamb was gone. Steve was the reason I was aboard the flight that day. Yes, as always, I was coming home to see family and friends and to see 2 of my best friends get married. But this time I'd packed a big bag and made plans to stay for quite a long time, because on this trip, I'd finally see the world premiere of The Green Flash, the first film I've ever made, and Steve Lamb was the star. In 2016, I wrote a story about Steve and the community of prolific maritime pot smugglers he was a part of. I dragged my friend Ethan Payne along to shoot the photos, and my husband Gresham Cash to protect us from the smugglers. Then, the story escalated into a documentary film that's taken us another 7 years to make. Between then and now, the distinction between the film and our own reality got hazy. But I guess that's the nature of documentary making. Now, Steve's voice, speaking his signature lines, pops into my head as if my own subconscious was stoned or slightly deranged. Even as I struggled to write this script, to find the words to describe why Steve means so much to me.
Because there's writer's block, and I've just got writer's laziness, which is actually ridiculous, because I got stories.
Gresham, Ethan, and I spent a lot of time with Steve, not just in person, but in the hours and hours of footage we captured of him, and in the home videos and photos and writings and news clippings we dug through to try to coherently depict this dynamic and contradictory person. Someone who loves the camera, someone who's very practiced at telling his story, and someone who also eludes really being known. We roped in our buddy Jake G to shoot footage and edit while he was in the last semesters of a counseling degree. And I wonder if this project wasn't a more challenging, but maybe even more fruitful study into human psychology than whatever he learned in school.
Yeah.
That was Jake. I've also spent a lot of time on the phone with Steve. I'd call when we were planning shoots, and he'd call to hear what kind of progress we were making on the film, and when we'd be back in St. Pete again. He'd leave me these amazing voicemails singing to me.
Jodi in disguise. She's got the bluest eyes. What's up, girlfriend? It's your #1 fan, Stevie Lamb.
A Jodi, Steve taught us, is the man who comes to steal your wife while you're in prison. It's also my name. I'm Jodi Cash. And I'd like to state for the record that my eyes are, in fact, green. In his 7 decades of life on Earth, Steve knew incredible adventure and extraordinary wealth, as well as the harsh consequences of both. And the story of his wild life changed ours. But before I tell you more about Steve, I'd like to take a moment to tell you about our partners, Last Prisoner Project. The Last Prisoner Project is a nonprofit organization dedicated to cannabis-related criminal justice reform. As the United States moves away from the criminalization of cannabis, giving rise to a major new industry, there remains the fundamental injustice inflicted upon those who have suffered under America's unjust policy of cannabis prohibition. Through intervention, advocacy, and awareness campaigns, the Last Prisoner Project works to redress the past and continuing harms of these inhumane and ineffective laws and policies. We're using our film, The Green Flash, and this podcast to help the Last Prisoner Project raise money and awareness. Visit www.lastprisonerproject.org or text FREEDOM to 24365 to donate and learn more. Now, back to the episode. The Steve we met in 2016 was a different man. He was still entirely mobile, maybe even dangerously so. We discovered Steve and his crazy stories through a strange stroke of fate, the kind of thing, like all of our time with him, that makes it easier to believe in divine intervention. We were meant to find each other. I was researching stories about Florida. I wanted to turn my attention back to the landscapes that have colored my dreams since my girlhood spent between the backwoods of Fort White, Florida, and the beaches of St. Augustine. Florida, for all of its complexity, has always been a precious place to me. My grandparents, my cousins, and my aunts and uncles on my mom's side lived down there all my life. When I was really little, there was nothing I loved more than when my mom would load my sister Megan and I into the car while we were still half sleeping, and she'd drive us down from Georgia, where we lived. We would wake up to the sun cutting through rows of pine trees and to the sight of oak trees dripping with Spanish moss. We'd drive down the bumpy dirt road to Nanny and Grampy's house, and they'd greet us with their Dalmatians and big hugs. Soon after, our cousins and Aunt Sherry and Uncle Rick would arrive, and we'd be blissed out, running through the woods with dogs, chasing frogs and lizards, and trying not to step on snakes or to run through the webs of banana spiders. We'd swim in Nanny and Grampy's pool until we were nearly hypothermic, and upon being pulled out, we'd sit in front of one of Grampy's famously unseasonal fires. After my parents got divorced, we moved from Georgia onto Nanny and Grampy's property in Florida. We turned their detached garage into what we called the Little House, where my sister and I slept in twin beds just across from our mom. Our years there were magical. It wasn't long before my dad followed us down, leaving behind our former family home in Roswell for another small cinder block cottage just down the road from us in Fort White. He and my mom tried to figure it out for a while. When it didn't work, my dad followed a gig and an insane man named Taylor to St. Augustine, where he continued to play music. Megan and I spent some of the happiest days of our young lives split between the green pastures of north central Florida and the beaches of Anastasia Island, where my dad landed an amazing apartment for less than $500 a month just down from the water. Eventually, my mom remarried and we moved back to Georgia. But Florida continued to plague my mind. I'd think about the deadbeats, outlaws, runaways, mystics, lunatics, and dejected musicians who seemed to show up at my dad's shows, or in his bands, or at his house after AA meetings. Storms and heat lightning, sulfurous water and limestone roads, alligators and sharks and sinkholes. Jutting out into the ocean, this bizarre launch point towards the rest of the world, Florida never ceased to fascinate me. A couple of years out of journalism school, I was determined to find bigger stories than my first content writing job could provide. My mind returned to the childhood images and characters that still frequently surface in my dreams. Stalking around for ideas, I called one of my favorite people on earth.
All right, so how can I help you, sweetie, with your story?
Pat Thomas had been the head of my master's program, and I was lucky to spend 2 years as her grad assistant, where I mostly used my hard-earned sorority skills to recruit prospective students throughout the state. Although life had drawn both of us to the University of Georgia, Pat and I connected over our Florida roots. She'd grown up a true Florida cracker, scrambling around the rural landscape of Denellen, a tiny town north of Tampa, before her brilliance earned her a scholarship to Berkeley and later Stanford, where she grew into one of the foremost health and science journalists in the country. Pat knew what I meant when I called her in search of a character.
Did I know colorful Florida characters coming up? Yes, tons of them.
She suggested I call one of her former high school classmates, John Lamb.
John Lamb was smart and handsome and well-spoken and a nice guy. But in 1975 at our high school reunion, he looked awfully affluent. I think he had a Jaguar. Nobody else that I went to high school had a Jaguar. And, asked what he did for a living. He had a fish camp in Steinhatchee. And that area had a rough reputation. I mean, these were essentially seamen, and they thought about themselves as pirates. So having a fish camp can be lucrative, or it can just mean owning a cabin and a boat slip and a couple of fishing skiffs. It can mean a lot of different things. But I mean, he was clearly doing well for himself. And I don't think, nobody interrogated that too deeply. But what I do remember is we all went outside, not all of us, some of us, invited by him, went outside to admire his car. And once we were outside by his car, he produced a joint. Now, I had gone to school at Berkeley, so he probably believed that I was not hostile to the idea of smoking a joint in a parking lot, which was certainly true. I remember that I was kind of surprised, because he was from this more, I don't know, just politically very different. Let's say you wouldn't have caught him in Berkeley in the 60s. Well, back then, he was making money somewhere besides renting out a cabin and a fishing boat.
I should call him, she said, and just ask some questions. I called John. He was amenable enough to the idea that I come down, scope out his fish camp, and write some kind of story about it. Neither of us really knew just what that story would be. But then, just as we were about to get off the phone, John said, "You can come down here and write whatever, but just so you know, my kin were tied up in all that drug stuff. You might want to do something on them." Wait. What drug stuff? His cousin, he claimed, was a man named Steve Lamb. In 1973, 19-year-old Steve, 5 of his young friends, and one of their dads, a local shrimper named Bubba, were busted smuggling 9 tons of marijuana into Steinhatchee, Florida. While offloading the weed from their friend's shrimp boat 2 nautical miles offshore, they got stuck with the massive weed piled high on a barge in Rocky Creek. The authorities didn't know it at the time, but they'd actually already sent off another 6 tons in semi-trucks on their way to Michigan to begin distributing the haul.
Customs officials say they have seized in Florida more than 9 tons of marijuana in what they call the largest marijuana haul ever in the United States. The marijuana, apparently from Jamaica, brought in by boat, valued at more than $4.5 million, was found in some 400 large bags on a strip of land in northern Florida. 7 men have been arrested.
Steve's St. Pete Beach community, where he and the other young men had grown up together, was totally shocked. And so was I. Now I was chasing a new story. Now I was looking for Steve Lamb. For my co-director Ethan and I, this early twist of fate is funny to look back on now.
So you started this thing.
That's Ethan.
It was fish camps.
Yeah.
What did you think fish camps were? I still don't really know what they are.
A fish camp, as I understand it, it can be something that you're renting, or it's just like your family fish camp, like a deer camp, whatever. It's just like where you're staying while you're getting up really early and going out and fishing every day. It's like a very basic, rustic housing situation that gives you just enough so that you can just keep fishing nonstop. And so I don't know that Pat ever thought I would be like really writing about fish camp culture. You know, she was kind of pointing me towards somebody who she thought was involved in something other than fish camps. I think she was very strategically pointing me towards something more interesting.
So I didn't realize this, but she already suspected that there was a drug story.
Yes. And she didn't tell me that so explicitly. I remember her mentioning her own experiences in Florida. But I think she just knew that or at least as she represents it now, and we both look at it, it's obvious that that's the story she was pointing me towards. But I definitely didn't realize that at first. I naively was like, oh, if Pat says fish camps are interesting, then fish camps are interesting. I'll go down and we'll take pictures, and cool, we get to go to a beautiful part of Florida and be on the water, and surely someone will take me on their boat.
And I think it's interesting to interject here that The story that becomes the film, which is about a man named Steve Lamb, started by trying to get in touch with a man named John Lamb, who claimed offhand he was related to Steve, but we still have no idea how, and Steve has no idea how.
Right. And of course I'm suspicious that John maybe wisely was like, maybe I don't want attention or anybody really investigating anything about my life. But I know that there's a famous drug story of someone with the same last name as me, and I'll tell her it's my cousin, and she'll try to get in touch, and that worked.
Ethan here, just taking a quick second to let y'all know about some friends of ours, Look Alive Coffee. Look Alive is a small batch coffee roaster out of St. Pete, Florida. They make fresh, seasonal coffees to fuel whatever you're working on. Whether it's a painting, a playlist, your favorite book, or a podcast based on a film, they're here to keep you energized and inspired. You can find them at lookalivecoffee.com. Now back to the show.
John gave me Steve's number, and when I called, I received...
We're sorry. The number you were trying to call has been disconnected.
I called John back, and he couldn't help. But I couldn't let it go. I started digging around. Upon learning about Steve and what came to be known as the Steinhatchee 7 bust, I stumbled upon his memoir, which he'd co-written alongside a woman named Diane Marcoux, and self-published on Amazon. There he was, on the cover in his 1970s glory, shirtless, tan, ripped, and in low-hanging jeans, cowboy boots, and sunglasses. I ordered the book. I tried calling numbers I found listed for Steve, Steven with a PH, Lamb on whitepages.com, and I got nothing. But when his book arrived, I cracked it open to find a foreword written by a man named Charles M. Fuss, Jr., author of Sea of Grass, The Maritime Drug War, 1970 through 1990. I looked him up too, and this time I got lucky. I left a voicemail on the home phone of Charlie and Carol Ann Fuss. Hi, this is Jodi Cash. I'm researching a story about a man named Steve Lamb and the history of pot smuggling in St. Pete Beach. If this is something you'd be willing to talk about, please give me a call back at 770. Charlie Fuss called me back.
Hi, Jodi. Hope you're having a good day. Charlie Fuss.
Charlie had worked in the National Narcotics Border Interdiction System staff and later the Office of National Drug Control Policy. In fact, his work did a lot to bring maritime drug smuggling to an end. He told me that when Steve came to him to write a note at the beginning of his book, he thought he was kidding. They'd seen smuggling overtake their little town of St. Pete Beach from opposing perspectives. Charlie didn't sign up for a life chasing down smugglers. He was simply a man who loved life on the water since boyhood, when he'd take his little sailboat out into Tampa Bay with his dog Pal and cruise around wherever the wind blew him. From an early age, he applied his skills with a sense of duty. He joined the Navy, did 2 tours of duty in Korea, and then studied to become an oceanographer and fisheries biologist on the GI Bill. He later used his expertise to track Soviet and other foreign fishing fleets south of Cape Hatteras and throughout the Caribbean.
One day I got this call from our headquarters office in Washington. Said, "Hey, Fuss, how would you like to work for the vice president?" And so my first question was, the vice president of what? And they said, "Ding dong, the vice president of the United States." And I said, "Well, I could try that if you think it's a good thing to do."
This was in the early 80s, a decade after the big bust that made Steve Lamb famous. When Charlie got that call, marijuana smuggling had become quite a thing in St. Pete Beach, and all up and down the Florida coast. Charlie knew about Steve and the Steinhatchee bust. In fact, he'd known who Steve and some of the other young men were since they were just boys, going to school and playing Little League with some of Charlie's children. Aside from trying to keep his own kids out of trouble, cannabis wasn't something he thought much about. He led an honorable life along the straight and narrow, trying to protect sea turtles and end bloody wars over crustaceans. But that work made him exceptionally equipped for a new job. Then Vice President George H.W. Bush asked Charlie to use what he knew about identifying suspicious fishing vessels to find the ships that were hauling tons of marijuana rather than shrimp or fish.
They needed somebody because about a third of all drug boats were fishing vessels. So they needed some instructive material to go out to the operating fleets. This was the first thing I had to do. It's a guide to fishing vessels of the United States, or all around, from New England around to the Pacific, and where you would expect to find them at certain times of the year, in like depth of water, for instance. And if they were in odd places, then maybe they should be considered suspect and put on the what we call the lookout list. So I did this, and some answers I couldn't figure out. So I started doing post seizures on drug boats.
But even with Charlie's thorough investigation of these ships and documentation for suspect vessel identification, there were smugglers mysteriously slipping past the careful watch of Customs, Coast Guard, and DEA agents on the lookout. He needed to know more about how they were pulling off complex trips with tons of cannabis aboard, undetected.
I said, to hell with it, why don't I just go and ask these guys that are in prison? And I spent a lot of time at Butner Prison up in North Carolina, where I tried to act like I was somebody else, but it didn't work. So they all knew who I was, and they called me Uncle Charlie around there.
Charlie developed the intelligence he did not only because of his vast knowledge of life at sea, but also thanks to his kindness and empathy. He knew the struggles faced by fishermen and shrimpers who'd been lured into smuggling, and he couldn't really blame them for applying their skills to a more lucrative business. He treated them with dignity while he did his own job.
I had a great deal of compassion for them, knowing what they normally went through in their daily lives. It's a hard way to make a living. It's dangerous, and you're by yourself against the elements. So I could feel compassion for these guys, even though I felt like what they did was not right, was totally wrong, but I could see how they would do it. So I started getting a whole bunch of questions answered.
Charlie used the intelligence he gathered in prisons to further instruct the law enforcement fleets in search of smugglers. By 1987, the big drug busts were becoming so frequent that smuggling operations couldn't justify the risk. They took to the air and other land routes. In what he calls the Silent Spring, a proud allusion to Rachel Carson's book In His Own Sea of Grass, he describes how suddenly the cannabis seizures at sea came to a halt. He'd done his duty, so then he turned to record it with the help of his wife, Carol Ann.
And the guys I worked with said, hey, Charlie, what are you going to do after you retire? I said, I don't know. So they said, well, you've written a bunch of stuff along the way. Why don't you write the history of the maritime drug war?
It was his own book that brought Steve Lamb in a roundabout path back into Charlie's life, both of them as older men making a living off of their stories.
Yeah, I tell you, I got to know Lamb. Some guy wrote an off-Broadway play about the Steinhatchee Seven. They had a reception for this guy at the local library, and the lady who was librarian at the time was named Lamb, but she denies any relationship to Steve. But anyhow, she called me up and said, Charlie, she said, would you come down here and participate in this question and answer thing, about the Steinhatchee Seven? So I said, yeah, it's been a long time, but I'll do that. So I went down there, and I'm sitting there, and this guy gives his presentation, and they talk about his play and where it went and all the things he did. And finally they get around to the lady asked me a question about the Steinhatchee 7, and I answered her, and in back of me, I hear this voice saying, "Yeah, I was there. I'm in Charlie's book." And it's Steve. I had no idea, he came up to me and he gave me a big hug, it's like I was his uncle or something. He said, "Yeah, I'm in your book, man." He said, "I'm writing a book." And I'm thinking to myself, yeah, you're writing a book, Steve. I can see this, your brain is fried. But he did a hell of a job on the book. He came to me and said, "Will you write a note?" And I said, "What the hell are you talking about? I was on the other side. I was trying to stop you guys." And he said, "Yeah, but could you write something?" And I said, "Okay." I said, "I'm not going to write anything until I read the manuscript." So I labored through it. It was pretty good. And I thought it was pretty realistic. And I said, "Okay, I'll write something, but you got to use what I got the way I write it, and you can't change it." So I wrote this note saying I didn't agree with all the things they did, but they were a likable bunch and all that stuff. And the book is a good read. And I thought it would be on the back cover of the book. So lo and behold, I get a copy of it, and I'm on the second page. So I had people tell me, did they pay you off to write that? Of course not. I wrote it from memory, and I'm glad I did. But he peddles those books everywhere, and I hope he's making a lot of money.
Peddling those books was where Charlie found Steve. When I called Charlie and told him that I couldn't get a hold of Steve, that all of the numbers were incorrect or disconnected or he was missing, Charlie made a habit of hopping down to Bayway Country Store and Butcher Shop, where Steve sells his book, and finally he found him. "There's some young kids from Atlanta who want to come down and tell your story," he told Steve. And Steve agreed to let us.
Hey, Jodi. It's the smuggler's ghost. Have you ever heard of such a guy?
Looking for the Green Flash is a podcast written and produced by
Ethan Payne,
Gresham Cash,
and Jodi Cash. It features an original score and sound design by Gresham Cash. We made this podcast to support the premiere of our first feature-length film, The Green Flash. This August, we're taking The Green Flash on tour throughout Florida and Georgia. We'll host screenings and special events at independent theaters from St. Pete Beach to Key West to St. Augustine before we bring it home to Athens and Atlanta. For more updates, follow us on Instagram and TikTok at The Green Flash Documentary, and sign up for our newsletter at www.thegreenflashdocumentary.com. Thank you so much for listening to Looking for the Green Flash. We'll be back with another episode next Monday. We'll see you in the movies.